Hello and welcome to week 8 of English 213. This week we're going to be talking about Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queen, an amazing text that I really look forward to talking to you guys about. You're to read this text, just the first book, which is found, I'd like you to read the introduction about Edmund Spenser on pages 766 to 768. And then the first book of The Faerie Queen, 775 to 934. Then I'd like you to participate in the conversation, where you're going to be close reading a stanza from The Faerie Queen, and then you're going to take a quiz on the first book of The Faerie Queen. So let's talk a little bit about who Edmund Spenser is. We are in the 16th century, as you'll remember, and this is a time when poetry has really become a national pastime, especially the pursuit of a national poetry. So there's no real full record of Edmund Spenser's life. We believe he was born around 1552, and he was born to modest means. That means he really didn't have any wealth, and at this time that was really, really difficult to rise above. He was educated at Cambridge, though, as a Caesar, which is a scholarship student, and he always wanted to become an established poet. The first major work that he wrote is called The Shepherd's Calendar, and I urge you guys to read it. It's found directly before the Faerie Queen. It was published in 1579, and you'll notice if you read it that the language in The Shepherd's Calendar is old, even for this time. Edmund Spenser adored Chaucer, and he tended to write in that way. The other thing you can pay attention to, and it's really obvious with Edmund Spenser's work, is spelling. The spelling of words, and even the spelling of someone's name, was not set in stone during this time period. Before the dictionary really was established and nailed down the spellings and meanings of words, people varied the way they spelled things. And for Edmund Spenser, this was very important. And so when he's reprinted in the Norton Anthology, they do not update his language. So you'll see the actual, real way that he, that he spelled things in the text. His first big break, he had a bunch of small jobs, some of whom he was associated with many famous poets, including Sir Philip Sidney, and then he ended up getting a post in Dublin, Ireland, near Dublin, Ireland. And this is important because Dublin, Ireland was Ireland itself was under siege by England, and it did not want to be so. It was being colonized, and so Spenser's job was to work for the state, England, and he had a first-hand account of what that looked like. And just like any other colonialization, it didn't look very pretty, what was happening in Ireland. And you see that in The Faerie Queen. You see the brutality of it. There was an uprising where he was living in Ireland, and I think in just a few years before his death. And at that time, he did escape. He was on a castle on 3,000 acres, over 3,000 acres, at Kilcolman, and in 1598 there was an uprising, and rebels burned down the house where he was living, and it's supposedly his child died in that fire as well. But he did escape with his life, but he died penniless in London in 1599. He never saw any sort of monetary reward for the hard work he did on his poetry. this poem is an epic poem. That means it's a long poem that tells the story of a hero. And this one was highly influenced by Homer, both the Iliad and the Odyssey, and Spencer said so himself. If you look at the letter at the beginning of The Faerie Queene in our selection, it's on page 777, a letter of the authors. He talks about how the Iliad and the Odyssey influenced him. He says, in which I have followed all the antique poets historical. First, Homer, who in the persons of Agamemnon and Ulysses hath ensampled a good governor and a virtuous man, the one to his Ilias, which is the Iliad, the other in his Odysseus, which is the Odyssey. Then Virgil, who like intention was to do in the person of Aeneas. After him, and then he goes into Italian epics as well. He also brings in, so not only is he influenced by Homer and Virgil, but he is also influenced by the myth of Arthur, and the idea of that being the actual British epic, right? Bringing that idea back into whatever is going to be the British or the English epic. We'll need to have Arthur involved, because that is their big story. That is the story that tells the story of England. Also, what's very important is moral philosophy. So Edmund Spenser was raised as a humanist, and that means that he was greatly influenced by Sir Philip Sidney's The Defense of Poesy, which we read last week, which put forward the idea that all knowledge should be obtained from poetry, and especially moral knowledge. So that idea that poetry can teach us how to be better people, Edmund Spenser took to heart. So if we look at The Faerie Queene, which was published first in 1590 and then in 1596, it's an epic. Like I said, it's an epic poem, and it's based on moral philosophy. That idea that it's going to teach a lesson, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the summary is the Knights of the Faerie Queene, and the Faerie Queene is a reference to Queen Elizabeth. And there's a lot, just like anything that's written nowadays, right? If you look at something, you'll notice that, like if you watch a TV show, there'll be references to current headlines, right? I don't know, I don't watch a lot of TV, but the TV shows that are the murder mystery shows that are always on, where they find a body and they're trying to figure out, and they usually pull the actual storyline from headlines, so they're retelling it again. We're just thinking about something like Saturday Night Live, where they humorously tell stories that have been happening recently in the news. So that's what's happening in this book. There's a lot of references to current events during Edmund Spenser's time, during the time that this is being written, including the colonization of Ireland, the aspects of Queen Elizabeth and her court. These are all happening within this text. But what's happening, the summary is that the Knights of the Faerie Queene, embodying virtues such as holiness, and that's the first, Red Cross in the first book, he is supposed to embody holiness, temperance, and chastity, pursue their quest opposed by allegorical monsters, and aided at crucial moments by Prince Arthur, and that is Arthur. It is both a personification allegory and it's a romance. So the format is, this is just 6 books long, but it was meant to be 24. He never finished it. It's a big book though. Each book is composed of 12 cantos, and each of those cantos consists of a certain number of 9-line stanzas, and these are called Spenserian stanzas. These are still recreated today. Each canto is headed by a quatrain that summarizes the action. Book 1 is about St. George or Red Cross, against the dragon, and the whole moral theme is about holiness. So the Fairy Queen is organized around these 6 virtues, one for each book, to alert you to the discussion of moral philosophy, the idea of how you're supposed to be. The poem's argument is embodied in personification allegory, an imaginative form in which characters bear a heavy burden of significant. I can't talk today, guys. I'm so sorry. Signification as ideas, passions, places, and even institutions are made into characters. And you can remember how that was done in Everyman. So I'd like you to think back on that while you're reading this. The goal of the text is to make good citizens and a good nation. So it's an epic poem about England that's written in a way to make everyone who reads it a better citizen, and England itself a better nation. Spenser saw Homer and Italian epic poets as writing moral philosophy. So when he read the Odyssey, he saw Odysseus's pursuits from island to island as a way to become a better person. And so that's the model that he's using. That's a humanist perspective. Again, we're coming back to allegory. And here's another definition of it. It is a long and perpetual metaphor. So the idea that I want you to be thinking about when you're reading the Fairy Queen, how is Spenser using allegory? How is it different from Young Goodman Brown? How is it different than Everyman? Right? Thinking about how allegory is used, how one thing is used to represent another thing on the surface, and perhaps another deeper thing, so one thing is representing something on the surface, right? As Faith represented Young Goodman Brown's wife, right, on the surface, and we watched her change in his dream. But she was actually representative, allegorically, of Young Goodman Brown's faith in God, his faith in his religion, and that is an important thing that's being done in that story. That's exactly what Spenser is doing in this story. Another thing we need to keep in mind is how Spenser is acting as a poet historical. On page 779, he states, "For the method of a poet historical is not such as an historiographer." So, and that's the term that was being used at that time for a historian. Okay, for a historiographer, discursus of affairs orderly. So a historian just tells the order of affairs, how they were done, accounting as well the times and actions and when they were done, right? But a poet thrust us into the midst. So the poet starts in something called in medias res, in the middle of things, right? It starts in the action of things, even when it most concerneth him, even when it most concerns him. And there recoursing to the things for past, and diving of things to come, maketh a pleasing analysis of all. So the idea is the poet actually analyzes the history by telling the story again from a different perspective. That's what he's doing in this work. He's telling the story again from a different perspective in order for us to learn from it, to get our moral lessons from the retelling of the story. And the purpose of it is to direct your understanding to the wellhead of history, so that we can learn from history, so that we can, the poet is telling us history in a way that it is more, it's teaching us a moral lesson rather than just the facts, right, as a historian would provide the history to us. So I have some links here. I know Spenser is a really tough poet, and I really, really encourage you to dive in there and really try to read this as much as you can. If you can't read that entire first book, read as much as you can deeply so you really understand it. Here's some links to some more information on Spenser and on the Fairy Queen itself. I think it'll be really useful for you guys if anyone's interested. Also, I encourage you to stop by my office and really talk to me about the Fairy Queen. I think it's a book that it helps to maybe listen to it out loud. I would like to read one of the poems, one of the stanzas out loud to you guys. This is stanza 2 from Book 1, Canto 1. I'm sorry, this is stanza 20 from Book 1, Canto 1, and this is found on page 787. And this is where the monster is spewing its what's inside of it out. And I think it's very important to pay attention to this stanza because it's telling us how to read the text in some way. So here it goes. Therewith she spewed out of her filthy mouth, a flood of poison, horrible and black, full of great lumps of flesh and gobbets raw, which stunk so vividly that it first him slack his grasping hold, and from her turn him back. Her vomit full of books and papers was. So the idea of the books and the pamphlets of the Catholic propaganda and the attacks, notably the attacks against Queen Elizabeth, that are inside this monster, right? With loathly frogs and toads, which eyes did lack, and creeping sought way in the weedy grass. Her filthy parbrake all the place defiled has. So this is an example of a really big, gross, in-your-face image that Spenser puts forth as a way for us to understand the current events that are happening, the bad stuff that's being said about his queen, the propaganda that's happening. Remember that the Fairy Queen has a very it's from a Protestant perspective, and you remember we're in the Reformation, so the Catholic perspective, up until quite recently, the Catholic faith has been the main faith for all of England, and this is just switch. So the Catholicism no longer has a hold on England, but that's a new switch, and there's a lot of propaganda being pushed in the direction of the people of England about the Queen, who is Protestant, about Protestantism, right? What's wrong with it, and also the idea. Also in this stanza, we see, we have the idea of this monster throwing up all of the great lumps of flesh, right? It's disgusting, right? It's black, and this black vomit that's full of books and papers. That's also an image for the consumed history, right? This is an image that tells us he's going to be rewriting history, right? And that we're going to be finding a new understanding of it. I really like this image as kind of a beginning of a new history for England, but that doesn't forget the past. And then we have those frogs without eyes, right? That creep away after she throws them up, right? These eyeless frogs that are creeping in the dry weeds. So that's an example of one Spenserian stanza from this giant work. If I were doing this in the discussion forum, which is what I'm going to ask you to do next, I would, and you cannot choose this particular stanza since I did just go over it a little. I'd start by saying I'd choose a stanza anywhere in Book 1, a stanza that speaks to you in some way, or that you find really hard that you want to unpack, right? Choose a 9-line stanza from the Fairy Queen that no one else has yet written about in the conversation, so make sure nobody else has already posted in the conversation this particular stanza that you're going to be working on. And as I said before, Book 1, Canto 1, stanza 20 is out of commission. You cannot do that one anymore. So you're going to begin by reading the stanza straight through. Then you're going to read for sense. That means I want you to read it really slowly and try to understand every word. You're going to read the notes and look up any words you don't know. So remember, for each of these stanzas, there's notes down below that refer to the notes about the poem. And some of the words like par break in the stanza I just read on the last line, that means vomit. Par break is another word for vomit. Also, there's a reference to Revelation 16:13. And I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. So we have a reference back to the Bible, back to the idea of a false prophet. So that tells us as a reader not to listen to it. So I want you to look those things up too. There might be words that are not, maybe you didn't know what the word, if you're reading this particular stanza, maybe you didn't know what the word ma, M-A-W, meant. And so you looked it up to find out it meant mouth, right? Or maybe you didn't know what, it says a floud of poison, right? Maybe you couldn't figure out what that meant. So you need to look up old spellings of words, right? If you're on campus, you can access the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, and you can find many of these older words in the Oxford English Dictionary. So then, once you've done all this work of really unpacking who's in the stanza, what they're doing, what all the words mean, I want you to restate or paraphrase what the stanza is about. How does it relate to the rest of Spenser's poem? How does he use allegory? Are there any references to current events during his time? And how is he acting as a historical poet? You're going to try to find a particular stanza where you can answer all these questions. There's a lot of stanzas in this book that you're required to read, and I just want you to choose one that you really feel like you can work with. So you cannot answer any of these questions by saying he doesn't use allegory. There's no reference to current events. He's not acting like a historical poet. That will not get you your 10 points. So really engage. Try to find a stanza where you can really think about this work as a whole. All right, that's it for this week. You guys are doing a great job. Please keep up the good work, and please continue to participate in our weekly conversations. There is a quiz this week as well. Please make sure you take it. It's just about book 1. Next week, we're moving on to the sonnet. We're going to learn about the history of the sonnet. We're going to read Shakespeare's sonnets, many of them. We're going to do a lot of close reading. I'm very excited about next week. And then I'm going to assign the first paper, which will have to do with close reading a poem. All right, guys, that's it. Please let me know if you have any questions. I look forward to seeing you guys online.